All right, the state of Minnesota ran a children's nutrition program so poorly overseen that fraudsters claim to be serving 6,000 meals a day in a town with fewer than 3,000 total residents, children and adults combined, and the state kept sending checks anyway, partly because officials were afraid of being sued for racism, which is what happens when the people supposed to catch the fraud are more afraid of a lawsuit than they are of the fraud itself. What you're about to watch is part of the House Oversight Committee's second hearing on what federal prosecutors have called the largest pandemic relief fraud scheme charged to date, a Minnesota nonprofit called Feeding Our Future that allegedly stole at least $250 million from a federal child nutrition program by submitting fake meal counts, fake rosters filled with fake children's names, and billing for food that was never purchased, let alone served. Representative Tim Burchett of Tennessee is questioning Minnesota Governor Tim Walz and Attorney General Keith Ellison about whistleblower retaliation, a secretly recorded meeting Ellison had with future fraudsters just 1 month before the FBI raided their offices, and why two other large organizations accused of hundreds of millions in fraud were allowed to simply dissolve without state prosecution. There's a lot here, and not all of Burchett's questions are equally well-founded, but some of them absolutely are, and the answers Walz and Ellison give are going to raise more questions than they settle. Let's watch the hearing, and I will give you my take at the end.
Chair now recognizes Chairman Burchett from Tennessee.
Say that with disrespect in your voice, Mr. Chairman. Governor, you mentioned that President Trump lost all 3 times. I believe that's an error, and that's a conspiracy theorist. I believe you spoke in error there, but
no, he lost Minnesota all 3 times.
Okay. I'm glad you corrected that.
He doesn't agree with that.
I don't care.
Chair.
We're good. Have you ever used taxpayer funds directly or indirectly to take action against individuals suspected of disclosing potential wrongdoing within a government entity?
I have not.
Well, almost 30 whistleblowers accuse you and your administration of retaliation. Would you say that's a conspiracy then?
I can't speak to what they said. I can tell you it didn't happen.
Okay. Are you aware of reports alleging state officials have engaged in retaliation against whistleblowers?
No, I'm not. Not specifically, no.
You're not aware of that when 30 have come forward? Okay.
I am not. I believe these are okay. Internet. We have options. The OLA, we have independent folks that they can come to, and I encourage them. It's against the law in Minnesota. I have executive orders.
It's against the law here, but it doesn't stop it. What actions have you taken to protect whistleblowers in your state, sir? And has anyone faced consequences for retaliation? If so, who?
Well, in Minnesota, we have nonpartisan legislative auditor. We have zero tolerance. The Minnesota Whistleblower Protection Act prohibits retaliation. I signed executive order in 2025, added protections. The law explains and clarifies protections around what reports are protected and who can report issues. They're strong. When I was here, I was an advocate for the IGs, and I think that's well known in my 12 years here that we need them.
Okay. Well, a whistleblower told our office that her supervisor at the Minnesota Department of Health and Human Services threatened to make her job difficult. And the supervisor that did that later received a promotion. Would that surprise you? And can you confirm if this account is accurate?
No, I can't confirm it, and I don't make HR decisions. But when I'm being very clear about this, there's a zero tolerance for whistleblower retaliation in Minnesota.
Can you, how can any agency combat fraud when retaliation goes unchecked?
It makes it more difficult. That's why we don't allow it.
Do you think that any of the fraudsters sent stolen funds to Somali terrorist groups?
Pardon me?
Do you think that any of the Somali folks that received funds sent any of that money to any of the stolen funds to Somali terrorist groups?
There's been reports done and investigations done on this, and I don't believe there's any proof to support that.
Okay. Mr. Attorney General, do you recall a December 2021 meeting with individuals connected to Feeding Our Future, during which you stated there will be cases that you know, I want you to feel free to call me directly, and then I call up and what's the problem? And let me tell you, just letting the inquiry from AG is sometimes enough to make people knock it off.
Congressman, yeah, I was at a meeting like that. Let me just say that I've reported on this numerous times. I've been in front of a committee in the Senate. I'm here today. I was in front of a state House Committee. This is a widely discussed matter, and I've been fully transparent. But let me just be clear. These people were fraudsters, as everyone here agrees. They were liars. They lied to me. They lied to courts. They lied to everyone. And I would like you to know that I do meet with community meetings all the time. I mean, it's a regular part of my job. Nothing unusual about me meeting with people. Nothing unusual about me telling people if you got a problem, my office will try to help you. But these people were liars and fraudsters.
Okay.
The main thing is I'd like you to know is that we're down so many federal prosecutors that it has put our ability to hold these people accountable definitely at a loss.
Yes, sir. Those 8-hour days do get long. In September of 2022, you issued a press release titled, "For 2 years, Attorney General Ellison's office has held Feeding Our Future accountable." Does that sound familiar?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Let me tell you, the Department of Education.
Does it sound familiar or not, sir?
It certainly does. And the Department of Education.
How much did you receive in campaign contributions from individuals charged in the Feeding Our Future case?
Every campaign donation I got was returned to all authorities.
Okay. Everybody knows about the $250 million in fraud for Feeding Our Future case, which was prosecuted by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Minnesota. But there were just 2 other large site sponsors that you settled with instead of prosecuting them. Why did you not prosecute Partners in Quality Care or the Gar Family Services? Because
my office doesn't have jurisdiction to prosecute in those cases.
Well, you allowed them to dissolve, but no one was prosecuted. And PIQC
they still may be,
sir, PIQC is accused of $300 million in fraud as significant assets, yet no charges and no attempts to recover taxpayer money. I'll remind y'all, $19 billion. I was a state legislator, and I can remember when our state budget was $19 billion. This is money that's been stolen, and it will not be recovered, and you all are to blame, and every dadgum one of you all ought to step down. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there, and I want to be precise about what is genuinely alarming versus what is political theater, because this story is both, and confusing the two actually lets the real failures off the hook. Let's start with the real failures, because they are significant. As of early 2026, 79 people have been indicted in the Feeding Our Future fraud. More than 50 have pled guilty, and 7, including the scheme's founder, Amy Bach, were convicted at trial. The former United States Attorney General Merrick Garland called it the country's largest pandemic relief fraud scheme charged to date. One defendant, Abdi Rashid Bixi Dul, claimed his site was serving 6,000 meals to children every day, a figure more than double the entire population of the town where the site was located. The federal government should never have been sending those checks. The question is why it kept happening. Here is something Governor Walz said on the campaign trail and has implied in this hearing, that the state was effectively forced by a court order to keep paying. Here is what actually happened, according to the nonpartisan Minnesota judge who was involved. Judge John Guthman issued a public rebuke of Walz's framing, writing that the Department of Education voluntarily resumed payments and that all of the Minnesota Department of Education food reimbursement payments to Feeding Our Future were made voluntarily without any court order. That is not a Republican saying that. That is the judge, the same Judge Walz blamed. The judge was not thrilled about being blamed, as judges tend not to be. Now, for the Ellison portion, and this is where it gets genuinely complicated in ways that matter, a secretly recorded 54-minute meeting took place in December 2021 between Ellison and several future Feeding Our Future defendants. The FBI had an active investigation running. The group asked Ellison to intervene with the Minnesota Department of Education on their behalf. And in the recording, Ellison is heard saying, "This has not come to my attention until now, really," despite the fact that his office had supposedly been involved in the investigation for 2 years. Less than 2 weeks after that meeting, Ellison received a $2,500 contribution from a man whose brother was later charged in the fraud. Other attendees also contributed. Ellison's office says it returned contributions tied to defendants after charges became public. Here's the part that is worth sitting with. The House Oversight Committee's interim staff report, titled "The Cost of Doing Nothing: How Tim Walz and Keith Ellison Fueled Minnesota's Fraud Explosion," is based on transcribed interviews with 9 Minnesota state employees and alleges that senior officials were aware for years of widespread fraud, deliberately misled the American people about their knowledge of the fraud, possessed clear authority to safeguard taxpayer dollars, and repeatedly failed to take meaningful action. That's a Republican committee making those allegations, so take the framing with appropriate context. But the underlying facts that the Minnesota Department of Education knew as early as 2018, that the administration resumed payments voluntarily, that Ellison met with fraudsters while his office was nominally part of the investigation, those are documented. Minnesota's nonpartisan Office of the Legislative Auditor found that Feeding Our Future's threats to accuse the state of racism had affected the agency's judgment. An investigator from the state's Fraud Investigation Office, who was himself Somali, said that concerns over being portrayed as racist made the Walz administration reluctant to pursue fraud allegations. That is an uncomfortable finding. Fraud shouldn't get a free pass because of the identity of the perpetrators, and state officials who bent their oversight functions because of that pressure bear responsibility for that. Now, and this is important, Burchett's question about whether fraudsters sent money to Somali terrorist groups, the Minnesota Department of Human Services has stated explicitly that federal prosecutors in Minnesota have explicitly said there is no indication or proof that defendants charged were funneling money into terrorist organizations. A City Journal article alleged terrorist connections, but the single named official in that article later claimed to have been misquoted and disputed the allegation. Walz was correct to say there is no evidence for that. That question was irresponsible, and it's worth naming it as such, even in the middle of a hearing where other questions were entirely legitimate. The language you can use when talking to others. The state kept paying a fraudulent nonprofit, partly because it was afraid of a lawsuit and afraid of being accused of racism, and officials who later boasted about accountability in press releases were simultaneously losing contempt of court fines to the organization they were supposedly holding accountable. That's a real failure, and it happened independent of whether any particular congressman handles the subsequent hearing responsibly. So what does this actually mean beyond a bad congressional hearing? The personal impact is direct. Federal prosecutors allege that only around 3% of funding granted to Feeding Our Future meal sites was actually spent on food, while the rest went to vacations in the Maldives, Dodge, Ram trucks, and at least one fraudulently obtained college degree that we know of. In a detail that will live in my head rent-free, one defendant literally paid a company called PayMeToDoYourHomework.com with stolen child nutrition funds, then graduated with a 3.42 GPA. With children's lunch money. The kids those meals were meant for didn't eat. That's not partisan. That's just what happened. The institutional impact is bigger than Minnesota. First Assistant United States Attorney Joe Thompson has said the fraud is just the tip of a very large iceberg, with 14 Medicaid programs under audit and deemed high risk. Many prosecutors at the Minnesota United States Attorney's Office resigned in January 2026, the office that was the primary engine of accountability in these fraud cases. With few prosecutors remaining and a wave of immigration cases following federal enforcement operations, work on fraud cases is likely to suffer. The people most likely to suffer from that slowdown are the very taxpayers everyone in that hearing claimed to be furious about. And for what? Walz dropped his 2026 re-election bid. He cited lack of time and a need to focus on his work, which is the political equivalent of, I'm leaving to spend more time with my family, while the state he oversees became, as one federal official put it, a national poster child for public corruption. Not because of one bad actor who slipped through, but because the system bent when it should have held. That's the legacy here, and it didn't require a Republican committee to make it true. As of early 2026, more than 50 people have been convicted in the Feeding Our Future case alone. The actual prosecutions were driven overwhelmingly by federal prosecutors, the same office that is now being hollowed out through attrition and reassignment. The Trump administration withheld $259 million in Medicaid matching funds, covering a single quarter from Minnesota over fraud concerns. The state is auditing 14 programs. Walz is no longer running for re-election. This isn't about partisan blame allocation, even though that's what every participant in that room wanted it to be. This is about what happens when government officials are more afraid of being called racist than they are of letting fraud continue, and what happens when the political incentives for oversight disappear and the personal incentives for looking the other way quietly pile up. The fraudsters didn't beat the system. The system handed them the keys. A court ruling became a convenient excuse. A fear of bad press became a policy posture. A meeting with future defendants became a campaign finance event. And the kids who were supposed to get those meals, thousands of servings a day, according to the paperwork, got nothing. The paperwork had their names on it. Fake names. Fake children. That's what happens when nearly every cent of a fraud goes somewhere other than the children it was meant to feed. And if the committee really wants accountability, maybe start with explaining why the United States Attorney's Office that actually got 50 plus convictions is now running on fumes, but that question didn't come up. Thanks for watching. If you found this breakdown helpful, please like the video and drop a comment with your thoughts. Share it with someone who wants the full story behind the headlines. And don't forget to subscribe and click the bell icon so you never miss the next video.